Uh, Thank you, Stefania. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's great that you are here with us today. My name is Grant Parker. I teach at Stanford University. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that Stanford University sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Together with Stefania Manfio of the Stanford Archaeology Center and Anthropology Department, and supported by Stanford Global Studies, I'm hosting the seminar series called Reframing Enslaved Pasts. Today's talk will be the fifth in a series of 6, and we have thus far covered had talks on the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic worlds. Today's topic will be focused on the Atlantic world. A quick word about the overall plan. Big data approaches to the study of enslavement already boast many digital projects and websites focusing mostly, in fact, on the Atlantic. The goal of our series is to bring well-established projects into contact with newer ones and also to provide critique of the kinds of methodologies involved. Presenters have each been asked to address the following questions. What are the scholarly goals and opportunities driving your research project? What are the affordances and challenges involved in your chosen approach? And finally, how would you characterize your use of databases? With these questions, we aim to facilitate a discussion about critical data practices around enslaved pasts, focusing on methodologies. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that several of us on this webinar have been involved in projects around the Indian Ocean labor diaspora, and particularly the Cape of Good Hope, supported by the Center for the Study, Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, SESTA here at Stanford, Gerald Groenewald, Laura Mitchell, Kerry Ward, Nigel Worden have worked with Stefania and me. This seminar is funded by Stanford Global Studies, which aims to archive the talks for its YouTube channel. I hope that each attendee is okay with that. We hope that the series will engage not only scholars, but also heritage practitioners working on histories and archaeologies of enslavement and other kinds of labor diaspora, and especially those comparing the Indian Ocean, Atlantic, and other systems, those committed to public-facing humanities, those interested in digital humanities and critical data practices. And it's for all these reasons that we are very, very delighted indeed that Professor Araujo is joining us today. And I will hand over to Stefania to introduce Professor Araujo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant, for introducing the series. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Professor Ana Araujo. Is a professor of history at the Historically Black Howard University in Washington, D.C. She's a current member of the School of Historical Study at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. She authored and edited 13 books on topics related to the history and the memory of Atlantic slavery. Her 3 recent single-author books include Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engage in the Past, 2020, Museums and Atlantic Slavery, 2021, and Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, a Transnational and Comparative History in 2017. Also, since 2017, she's a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project. Currently, she's working on 2 books projects, Humans in Shackles, an Atlantic History of Slavery in the Americas, under contract with the University of Chicago Press, and The Gift, How Objects of Prestige Shaped the Atlantic Slave Trade and Colonialism, under contract with the Cambridge University Press. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Professor Ana Araujo today. And she's going to talk about the history of slavery and material culture. Can objects help us understand the lives of enslaved people? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefania and Grant for having me. Then you saw the title of the talk. You are going to see that to a certain extent, what I will be doing with this talk is more than on the Atlantic slave trade and the slavery, and you are going to see to which extent we can apply this examination of material culture and objects to understand elements that are related with the lives of enslaved people. And this I am referring since the moment that Africans were captured along the African coasts, then transported to the Americas and labored then in the Americas, then either in urban settings and also in plantations. Now, my training to do this kind of work, just to situate from where do I come from to work on this topic. I was first trained as an art historian, then with a PhD in art history. And it's after this PhD in art history that I finished then a second PhD in history. And these days I am somewhat coming back to this, to my earlier interests in order to approach then material culture of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, particularly looking then at the specific objects that today are housed then in museum collections. Then I am not an archaeologist, and I am not trained as an archaeologist. Then this talk is a reflection about how material culture and the Atlantic slave trade, meaning here things and tangible objects, including then items such as currencies, daily tools, architecture, and monuments associated then with the history of these two human atrocities, can offer us insights to understand how the institution of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade operated, and how the trade then in African persons in the Atlantic basin was connected to the Indian Ocean trade. We're going to see that not all these objects, they allow this kind of connection, but some of them, they could allow us to make these connections that are so absent from the works of historians of the Atlantic world. On the other hand, I also want to emphasize, even though I will not present a database, I do not own any database, then formally, I have informally created a database of then dozens and dozens of these items, objects, and artifacts that I collected information about them over the years. Now, most of this work with material culture of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade has been done by archaeologists, then academics that are formally trained to engage material culture. And to some extent, it has been done also by art historians. Now, we know that most of this archaeological work, when you are talking about the slavery, has been done already then in ancient Greece and Rome, then two societies that, according to sociologist Moses Finley, were among the 4 slave societies in the world, and ancient Rome and Greece, along with Brazil, the US South, and also with the West Indies. Also, we know that the slavery in ancient Rome and Greece was not racialized as it became in the Americas much later when the Atlantic slave trade started then in the late 15th century. Yet, when you are addressing material culture, you are going to see that there are ways to establish connections between ancient slavery and Atlantic slavery. Also, in recent years, art historians have been studying visual culture of slavery, and to a lesser extent, material culture of slavery as well. Then any work with a material culture must take into account the work of these two different disciplines that are archaeology and art history. But at the end of the day, historians themselves, very few of them have paid attention to material culture of the slavery. This said, despite this kind of gap, we have museum curators, for example, and public historians who have widely used material culture to tell the history of slavery in museum exhibitions. And of course, there are a number of historians in general who are now engaging with material culture, but not necessarily historians of slavery. And to a certain extent, my work here is a call that we engage objects as historians and use objects as sources when you are writing the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Now, most of what we have access, when you are talking about having access to these different objects, most of these existing objects, they are of course in museum collections, or they are visible to us in museum exhibitions. Then in more recent years, for example, around the world, we are going to see museums addressing then the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, and also colonialism as central engines that contributed then to the formation of their collections. We know that there has been a work of reckoning with the colonial past and the links with the Atlantic slave trade when you are referring to a variety of museums, especially in Europe, but also to a certain extent in North America, and even in places like Brazil, for example. And as part of this process, of course, European countries such as England, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands, as well as Brazil and the United States, unveiled new museums and exhibitions to address then these traumatic pasts. Now, the growing inclusion then of the slavery in the museum is also connected to increasing calls to remove monuments honoring slave merchants, slave owners, and individuals who supported the slavery. And these public devices that are these monuments, they are also part of what we can call then material culture of slavery. At the same time, all these discussions about these monuments are linked then to the call for the construction of monuments and memorials that pay homage then to enslaved people. And as we can see over the last years, especially here in the United States, but also in Europe, you have been different groups identified as Black, as Indigenous, as Latinx, for example, who have led then initiatives and also demonstrations challenging then museums to address the histories of communities that have been historically excluded from these institutions. Now, many museums, they use then material culture as a central tool to present the history of slavery. Then on the one hand, we can ask ourselves how material culture can help us understanding the history of slavery. And on the other hand, we can also assess how museums are using material culture to address this, the history of these human atrocities. Then we need here, on the one hand, individuals who are able to address material culture, but also individuals who are able to address the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Then examining this material culture, using these sources require also an understanding of how these different atrocities operated. Now I will start sharing my screen. Then let me just go here and go on presentation mode. And here we go. 1 second. Then in this general work that I have been doing then over the years, and if you look at if you try to establish categories for these objects that are displayed in museums or that are housed in museum collections, either in Europe, Africa, or the Americas, I was able to identify these 5 categories of objects. The first category, then slave trade items or currencies, consists, then this kind of object, we can refer, for example, to copper and iron manillas, glass beads, cowrie shells, and so on. Then these are usually considered as goods, but indeed many of them are currencies. The second category are objects of prestige that were exchanged as gifts among Africans and Europeans during the Atlantic slave trade. Then we have a third category that consists then of work instruments. We have a fourth category that consists of this kind of artifacts, then wealthy artifacts, luxury artifacts associated then with the wealth generated by the trade. And this, of course, includes silverware, porcelain, and furniture. Many of these kind of items that I am referring here, then, especially the first and the third and the fourth one, these categories are the kind of items that many archaeologists, they find when they are then conducting field work in different sites that were associated to the Atlantic slave trade. Less common, however, is to find during this work in the field, for example, these objects of prestige. Most of these objects of prestige have been already for a while then in museum collections. And then we have a final category. There is the last one that is associated then with these instruments of punishment. And these are instruments that we find in all different museums, then Americas, Europe, and Africa. And we have then instruments of punishment that include, of course, shackles, chains, and also is what we call slave collars and other instruments that were used then to restrain enslaved people. Now, before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, West African and West Central African societies, they employed several kinds of currencies in long distance trade. Then with the development of the Atlantic slave trade in the second half of the 15th century, currencies such as tobacco, alcohol, firearms, and gunpowder, as well as luxury products such as clothes, hats, and a variety of objects, shaped the commercial transactions between Europe and American and African traders, as well as local agents. If we take, for example, the example of the cowrie shells, then there has been works on this recently, and I think here is in particular about this latest book by historian Toby Green. Then he was not the only one to work on this, but his work is probably the most recent and that people know better at this point. Then cowrie shells, we know that they originated then in the Maldives Islands in South Asia and were introduced then in the African continent by Muslim traders through the Near East and or the Indian Ocean, then through these caravan traders that crossed the Sahara Desert as early as the 11th century. And cowrie shells were first recorded in Arabic sources in the 14th century. Then in the 16th century, the Portuguese started transporting cowries by sea around the Cape of Good Hope. And between the 16th and the 19th centuries, cowries became the major form of currency used in West Africa and West Central Africa, where they were known as through the name of Zimbu. Now, during the 18th century, contemporary observers who visit Ouidah, for example, Ouidah is the second largest African slave trading port during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, then on the Bight of Benin. And during the 18th century, then contemporary observers who visit Ouidah, they reported the use of cowries as currency as well. Then cowries were imported also in Senegambia, the Gold Coast. Of course, I already mentioned the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and also Angola. Even though in some of these regions, cowrie shells were not domestically used as currency, but they were rather transported to the interior where traders then used them to purchase enslaved people and other commodities. And other currencies, of course, included then manillas, bracelets, then manillas, that's those sorts of bracelets that existed in all sizes, weights, and they were usually made of copper and iron. And we also had, of course, glass beads that, like the cowrie shells, could be arranged in strings to be used then as currencies. Then, despite this great variety of currencies, most museum exhibitions, of course, they just exhibit perhaps three kinds of them, then manillas, cowrie shells, and the glass beads. If you take the example of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., we have these currencies illustrating the history of the initial history of the Atlantic slave trade. Then you have manillas, you have the cowrie shells, and we also have to a lesser extent then different kinds of beads. Sorry that I let's see if I will not have any. Okay, I'm fine. Now, you are going to see later that these, of course, in this particular case of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, these are just a few examples, because what they have in terms of collections, in terms of this currencies is much, much, much bigger. And you are going to arrive there when you are going to, when I will be towards the conclusion. Then here, this example that I'm giving to you is the early exchanges between Africans and Europeans. And we have a very brief overview of what each one of these currencies, how they were used, how they were employed. And of course, that perhaps for many viewers who visit this kind of exhibition, they could think by looking at them that the human beings, then enslaved Africans, were purchased with bubbles. Now, if we look, however, at the museum's collections, and here I'm just giving a few examples that come from the digital repository of the Smithsonian collections. We have a large number, for example, I'm just giving one example of these glass beads, but we also have, in addition to them, iron holes and many other currencies that in an exhibition, or if you are referring to the work of historians, could have allowed to explain much better the importance of these currencies in these early exchanges. Then we are going to come back to this point later in the conclusion. Now, in addition to that, across the Atlantic, other museums, they adopt a similar approach when they are treating the history of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, even if many of these exhibitions are more modest. For example, the permanent exhibition on the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in the Nantes History Museum, this is in Nantes, France, features one very small display showing these currencies. And we also have in the exhibition London Sugar and Slavery in the Museum of London Docklands, some of these currencies as well. Then the approach is always very similar, but in each one of these cases, we are dealing here with museums in the global north, in Europe and the United States. And in these different cases, they have repositories that allow us to find these different items then in their collections. We also have, as you can see, a similar approach when we examine the case of the International Museum, Slavery Museum in Liverpool. Then in this case here, of course, we have the objects, but we also have panels explaining them, as we can see. Then we have lanillas, we have again glass beads, and we have cowrie strings. However, we have also this history being told through material culture, then this history of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade being told through material culture, not only in the institutions where the topic of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade is being explored. In art museums, we also find these objects, as we can see here in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And here we just have one single display featuring then this kind of currencies, and this in the section of African art. Now, the problem here, however, is that despite the fact that both of the objects and the repository of this museum address the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, we have no mention to that. Then this is a way that something that we are going to bring at the end of the lecture as well. Now, in addition to currencies, we have also these objects of prestige that were exchanged between Europeans and Africans, not only during their interactions on the Atlantic coasts of Africa, but also through diplomatic missions intended then to negotiate the terms of the Atlantic slave trade. For example, the crown that you see here at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam was meant to be a gift from the English to the king of Ardra, that is Alada, then located in present-day Republic of Benin in West Africa. And this then the date of the crown is middle of the 17th century. Now the English, like other European powers, used these diplomatic gifts to lubricate the trade in enslaved Africans. This specific gift, however, never reached the king of Ardra, and Dutch Admiral Ruyter seized it while on a mission to expel the English from a Dutch fortress on the African coast, and this is how the object survived. Now, these exchanges, they had two directions as well. West Africans, they also sought to please European powers with gifts of prestige. And here is one of these examples. In an embassy that King Adalonso, there were several embassies that the Kingdom of Dahomey sent to Brazil, but there is one of these embassies sent to Brazil then in the early 1800s. He sent this carved throne as a gift to the then Prince Regent Dom João. This throne, as other Dahomean wooden thrones, bear elements similar then to Akan thrones, but they gradually also incorporated other formal elements influenced very often by the Afro-Brazilian presence in the Bight of Benin. This throne and other gifts sent by Adalonza to Dom João have been housed at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. You know that this museum was destroyed in September 2018. None of these gifts survived. I did work with this particular throne and 2 other objects, but Brazilian historian Marisa Carvalho Soares, she has been working on this collection since then, about 2010, and she has a book that is coming out that will be focusing on this collection. Unfortunately, the book is in Portuguese, but I hope it will be translated in English soon. Now, despite the central role of other objects, such as work instruments, we have a few museum exhibitions that address the history of slavery that feature these daily instruments used by enslaved people to perform their work. And these would be the kind of items that would allow us perhaps to better understand the daily lives of enslaved people. The currencies are still about the trade, and especially on the African side. When you are talking about the gifts of prestige, it is still about the trade, and we are still referring to the elites, then to slave merchants, and then different rulers and their agents on the African coasts. But here, working instruments would be then probably, in terms of material culture, the better way to reach the ordinary people, the largest number of men and women of African descent who were not rulers, were not merchants, were not traders, but were those who were captured and sold during the Atlantic slave trade. Then one example that I have here on the left is then in Medford, Massachusetts, the Royal House and the slave quarters. And this is a very small private heritage site and museum that emphasizes the work of enslaved people owned by the royals, the royals who helped to fund the creation of the law school at Harvard University. And you can see here then some objects that are also then were also recovered during archaeological work. And despite that, of course, that despite the fact that these objects, of course, were luxury objects, at the same time, they were objects that were manipulated on a daily basis by enslaved people because they were those working and serving these slave owners in the domestic space. The same can be said, for example, when you are referring then to these other objects that you see here on the right, that come from the exhibition Slavery and Freedom at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Here you see then this kind of copper sugar pot. This is the kind of object that reappears all the time in these exhibitions, sometimes connected to teapots or coffee pots to connect the sugar to the consumption of tea and coffee, but not with much emphasis on how these objects were manipulated or how the process of manufacturing sugar occurred during that period. Now, in addition to that, then in connection with the image on the left, we have many exhibitions and museum collections that conserve these luxury items. And many of these items, then they appear in exhibitions, but they are also part of the museum collections. They usually then they are intended, they are presented to focus on the wealth of the slave owners and the slave traders. And usually, of course, you have furniture items and tableware, including the items that you can see here, these sugar cones, all items that were also sugar cones, sugar tongs, then of course porcelain and items that were associated with the consumption of sugar. As you can see here, the same kind, and this one is the London Sugar and Slavery, and then this is the Museum of London Docklands, and you see very similar items and displays on at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. Now, many of these exhibitions, however, as you can see, despite of how much you can tell about the history of the institution of slavery itself, and also about how the work of enslaved people, one, helped to produce this wealth, and also how enslaved people manipulated these items. Of course, that these exhibitions, they are not doing this kind of job completely. And this is where the work of historians doing this kind of work could highlight, could develop much more the understanding of the institution and the work and lives of enslaved people, just by the focus on these objects. Now, in some other cases, when you are talking about luxury objects, we have objects that themselves tell this history of the Atlantic slave trade. This is one housed at the John Brown House Museum in Providence, Rhode Island. This is a museum adjacent to Brown University. Then again, another museum that is associated to the history of Brown University. And here we see then this object that, in addition, of course, we have paintings and all this kind of artwork, but we have also then this blue and white transfer printed earthenware plate that depicts a view of Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast in West Africa. And this, of course, as you know, in this region, then this castle was one of the major slave depot where the English traded in enslaved Africans. Now, as indicated then in the on the label of this that is displayed along with the object, this was an object then that was donated by a Brown University alum, then to the whose family indeed was contemporary to the Browns, and this was then given as a gift to the museum. And this is an artifact then that dates 1820, and was part then of a series of similar items like this, that indeed we can find several of similar items that are housed in other museums, also in Rhode Island, but also elsewhere, that were produced during the same period, and were then produced in a period when slavery was still active in the north of the United States, and that tells this history of the trade. Then the object itself represents the trade. The object was owned by slave traders and slave owners and was manipulated by enslaved people. Now, certainly, then you can see here one of these a different version of the same item, and you see then more clearly here then the how the trade was operating in that area. Now, certainly we can say that the largest number of artifacts that are displayed in museums in Africa, the Americas, and even in Europe, and that survived then in museum collections and also in private collections. These, most of them are instruments of punishment. I will not go in detail about these instruments, and these are also items that archaeologists, they find during their work, but many of them, as you can see here, then are these chains, muzzles, irons that were used to brand enslaved people. And many of these objects, then of course, they tell this history of the trade and the Atlantic slave trade, because many of these items were also found then in the hold of the slave ships when they were outfitted to go to the African coasts and then to the Americas. But they also correspond to objects that were used in the Americas as well. We see other examples here, then in Bordeaux, Musée d'Aquitaine, also in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. In some cases, I have been criticizing this approach of displaying these objects as artworks with this particular kind of light, that these are objects of terror that are presented as beautiful objects than in this kind of glass display. Now, in addition to that, and this, for my colleagues who are in Portugal, you know these objects that have been highlighted since 2017. In the Americas, we have a number of these slave collars, but in Europe, you can find these particular kinds of slave collars that had indeed the names of the slave owners, and there were not necessarily instruments of punishment, but were instruments of control to identify the owner of enslaved people. Then they are perhaps smaller than the ones that we see in the Americas. They have locks, as the one that you can see here. There is here a different one. Then these two have been featured in Portugal, and recently then in an exhibition that opened last year at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. We have a similar item that is smaller, but again with the coat of arms of Nassau that also indicate then who would be the possible owner of the enslaved individual who had to wear this kind of device of punishment, torture, and then displaying the power of the slave owners. Now, if you want, then I would like to conclude here. Then let me just see. Okay, here I just want to come back to this one, because the connection that I was doing in the beginning between ancient slavery and slavery and Atlantic slavery can be done also through objects and images, and this Zoninus collar is one of them. Then this is a Roman collar, and again the collar displays this message, then indicating who was the slave owner of the person bearing this collar. And the same way that these ones they do, the ones found in Portugal for enslaved people who were, of course, here in then enslaved in urban areas, which was similar to what we could find in Greece and Rome. Now, to conclude, I would like then to emphasize that each of the objects presented here as examples, they offer a large number of possibilities to study the social culture and economic history of the Atlantic slave trade and the slavery. In some cases, they also offer, not all the time, but in some cases, they also offer the possibility of studying the daily lives of enslaved people. But despite these possibilities, historians studying slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, they have resisted to embrace the study of material culture in order to better understand the history of these atrocities. At the same time, as we can see from the museum displays, using material culture to tell the story of slavery also risks to repeat the same central problem when it comes to tell the history of slavery, which is dehumanize enslaved people. Then the same problem that we discussed regarding databases, and even about creating databases of material culture, is that these items by themselves, they are dehumanizing. Then how can we deal with that? Then this happens then in several ways, including when, for example, these institutions, as I already mentioned, they insist in fetishizing then these instruments of punishment that are very often presented as artworks. And finally, the point that I want to make to close this talk, in order to connect the discussion to the focus of interest in the series, is that despite the great limitations regarding then the current use of these objects in museum exhibitions, many museums in the global north, if not all of them that I mentioned during this talk, they keep separate searchable databases, sometimes with thousands of these objects. Still, in many cases, these objects are not described with any words that associate their existence to the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, even if they would be able to offer us, if this work had been done, they would be able to offer us new clues then to understand the engines of these atrocities, and certainly better establish the links between the Atlantic slave trade, then the slave trade in the Atlantic basin, and that in the Indian Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for a very fascinating and vivid talk. If there are any comments, questions, please put them in the chat, and Stefania or I will convey them.
If you feel also that you'd like to speak, and we can able you to talk. If you'd like to make the question in first person, feel free to use both. Sorry?
I mute myself just okay. In case.
While colleagues are coming up with their questions, the question that I've been aware of is that if items are in everyday use, especially that category of items that you've presented to us, there were the kinds of low-value items that were in everyday use. B, we know that the likelihood that the labor force at X place and time would have been enslaved. We are basically dealing with circumstantial probabilities in many cases, rather than a distinctive signature. Is that a problem? How can we if an item comes from an enslaved society, a society where there is enslavement, and perhaps on a substantial scale, as Finley would define it, that doesn't mean that the item is a distinctively an enslaved item linked to slavery, with the possible exception of the last category that you've shared with us. So I suppose this is it's both a definitional and a contextual and a practical problem, all wrapped in one.
Okay, let me unmute myself. Well, this part of this work is still work in progress, but one of the points, because I have been doing more work on these objects that were the gifts that were exchanged during then different contacts between Europeans and African rulers and agents. Now, I have been doing now work on these objects of everyday use. And it is challenging. And I did work also on the instruments of punishment. There are allegedly clearly items associated to enslaved people. But you see that even those items, the colors, for example, the one in the Netherlands, until recently has been identified in their collections as a dog collar. Then even that object that is associated with the Atlantic slave trade and with other similar collars has been, let's say, mislabeled. But the objects that are distinctive are objects that were, among other things, fabricated by enslaved people. And there are museums right now that are working more and more on this kind of objects. And I think that especially the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it's challenging because of the fact that many of these works remain, many of these artisans and artists, they remain anonymous. But in many different places, all those were producing furniture, ironwork, even pottery and different other items were enslaved people. Then this is where we need to do work. And I think that there are museums who are doing now this, recently started to do this kind of work. For example, I know about the Baltimore Museum of Fine Arts. We don't think, when you are talking about fine arts, we don't think about looking information about the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in an art museum, but usually it could be the case that the answers are there. Then the challenge remains to find the distinctive feature that make that object tells us this story. But I believe that the objects are there. And when they are there, even if we have a few items, we can find enough connections very often to better tell this story.
Thank you. We have some question in the chat, and Gerald raised his hand. So maybe we can start with you, Gerald, and then we can read the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you, Ana Lucia. That was fascinating. I'm not very familiar with this field, but it strikes me that most of the items that you showed are things that are, I don't want to use the word peripheral, but around slaves as individuals. So the fact that, slaves did have some material culture of their own, but it was not valuable, and therefore, it wasn't mostly kept. And as someone who works mostly with textual evidence, I wonder to what extent historians of material culture consider textual evidence of material culture. So I work primarily with court records, and every so often you get wonderful glimpses of material goods that belong to slaves, most often clothes, but sometimes I have come across description of things like scarves and combs or brushes. And of course, these things don't exist anymore because nobody valued them. And I was just wondering if you could give an indication if these type of sources are being used in this field that you talked about, I'm also thinking about things like in the US South, you have these wonderful advertisements for runaway slaves, and they would often give detail of their clothing, you know, and their hairstyles and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be wonderful if textual historians can come together with, you know, visual historians and kind of combine their insights into this. Thank you.
Thank you. What I would say regarding this particular, then perhaps I am going too far here, but this idea of saying that enslaved people didn't have a material culture, that they didn't own things, or that the things that they owned were of little value, I think that we can challenge that, especially in the urban areas and in some particular places. Then in urban areas, if you refer to large port areas like Rio de Janeiro and Bahia, there are then colleagues doing this kind of work that is not my own work, but I think here about Lisa Earl Castillo, there is also Mary Hicks. They did work combining this idea of what textiles, for example, that are described in wheels. Eduardo França Paiva also in Brazil, then textiles, different kinds of other objects such as shoes and things that perhaps didn't survive, but are described in the sources. There is also a great, we have a great number of visual images, either photographs, of course, 19th century, but also we have illustrations of travel accounts that these are visual images that describe this material culture. Now, this is there, and this is why we should be looking at those sources. But in addition to that, and this is something that I cannot present here, the full evidence, but I think that is not hard to confirm that, which is the fact that the things that were made by enslaved people matter as well as part of this material culture. Enslaved people were fabricating a lot of things that people, either them or then slave owners, were trading and using in their daily lives. And this, I think, that is the work that is being done at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, to emphasize that these were made by enslaved people, or it was made by freed people, because of course that at some point it's hard to establish the exact legal status of that person when those objects were produced. But I think that there is a claim to be made here that the furniture, wooden work, iron work, all this, weaving, all this was being done by enslaved people. The enslaved people were not only producing these items that slave owners were wearing and consuming, were also being produced by enslaved people. Then this is, I would say, that would be an additional connection that is possible to be worked on. And there are records, there are certainly records to show that these were being produced by enslaved people, and with which kind of materials and all this.
Thank you. I can read the first question from the chat. This is from Ibrahim. Did you look at the collection in African Museum? Usually this is the weak part of their museum.
Yeah, I would say, Ibrahima, that this is something that I didn't do. How can I say, in any significant way? The places where I did do is in the Republic of Benin. I didn't look at the collections. I only looked at what was displayed in different museums. For example, the Museum of History in Ouida, then the museum in Abomey. Then I didn't look in detail in their collections, in what is not displayed. But what was displayed in these places until recently could be very often similar to these displays that we see in Western museums, because some of these exhibitions have been conceived by Western scholars. I think here about Pierre Verger in the case of the museum in Ouida, but they are changing these museums. Then even the throne that I just showed to you, the throne by Adadonza that doesn't exist anymore. These objects that were repatriated to the Republic of Benin are objects that are similar. Then there are the throne of King Gezo, for example, has similar elements with the one that Adadonza sent as a gift to Don Juan. Then this is I know that is the weak part, and this is why restitution is now also being debated, because all these objects that we are talking about, very often they are here or in Europe, and very often they are not on display. They are in the reserves and not visible to anyone.
Thank you. Next question from Alex Boruki. I was wondering to what extent silver was present in these objects, thinking particularly of the itinerary of silver from the Americans to Europe and to Asia, or from the Americans direct to Africa. Thinking of silver as currency, coins and patacas, and also as luxury items and object of prestige. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alex. Yes, silver has been present. Then as currency and also as objects of prestige. I would say that from what I can see, especially 18th century, second half of the 18th century. And once the trade intensifies, then during the 18th century, but then especially in the 19th century, you are going to see a shift with a number of these objects of prestige that sometimes were, how can I say, inspired from what we could find in some African objects. Then these objects that were given as gifts, instead of being in iron or copper, would be produced then with silver, then silver from the Americas. Now, making these the connection sometimes is hard, because of course that these were usually objects that were fabricated in Europe and would be brought to the African coasts. And then we have the French, the British, and the Portuguese in particular that would be then bringing this kind of items to the coasts. And these would include, for example, cutlery and different other objects that were, let's say, in demand, but also objects of prestige. Then we would have to see in particular how this silver, then we know that this silver is coming mainly from South America, but then to different parts of Europe and then reaching different parts of Africa. Then I would say that yes, you are totally right on that.
Thank you. So next question is from Brenda Waver. Most of the objects you have discussed are items that are presented with singular value. Why is it that so many museums do not draw on a larger material, for example, archaeological context, that could draw out more than a simple reflection on specific objects or categories? For example, as if each item is a singular object of art. To clarify, archaeological interpretation is about space, form, and time, giving context and the relationship between objects, material culture. But museums don't focus on these relationships, but on singular objects, as if each exists in a vacuum.
Yes, I agree with that, but I also think that it's not only because archaeology is absent from this kind of intervention, sometimes then the work by historians that is needed to then we need interdisciplinary work in order to convey this stories. And we also know that despite some people, they still claim that the disciplines, we still have disciplinary division. We have art history, still have history, and people in different programs and trained in specific disciplines. But very often we have historians not reading what archaeologists are doing, and not reading what art historians are doing. Then when it comes to convey these histories, it becomes problematic. And the museum, as these are also spaces, it would be necessary to have this dialogue in order to provide this context. Sometimes also what happens is that many of these displays, they are trying to do a lot at the same time. They are conveying images, they have the objects, they sometimes have sound, they sometimes have images in movement, and all this together sometimes is just is too much. Sometimes it is intended to provide the context, but the main element that is what was the significance of these objects, how were they employed, who were those who were fabricating these objects. These are questions that remain absent. I'm not totally sure if this is because there is no work being done with archaeologists in these institutions, but perhaps even historians, sometimes they are absent, and when they are present, yeah, it's true that they are not engaging with material culture. Then this is one of the problems of museums these days that are presenting this history of slavery, or at least attempting to do so.
Thank you. Next question, Helen Fernand Sacco. Are there any examples of collections or displays that do come closer to providing or illuminating the connection to the enslaved that you discussed?
The collections itself, I would still say that the case of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. is probably the best example. But the problem here also that I would like to say is that these objects, the same problem that we have with the Textual archive, because there are no archive of slavery, then anyone studying slavery, you have to take these documents in different kinds of archives. The same happens with material culture. Then the Rijksmuseum is not a museum of slavery, it's a museum, an art museum, and it's just now they are taking those collections and bringing to light all objects that have a connection with this history. The same happens with the National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C., or the British Museum, or the Cabernet Museum in France. Then the collections itself, they are somewhat everywhere. The advantage, however, is that the collections in these richer museums, they are searchable now. Many of them, they have already images as well. But I would say that for those that are making that connection in terms of their displays, the case of the National Museum of African American History and Culture is one of them. And this is new, and this probably will lead other museums of presenting these items in ways that historians and visitors can make more connections.
Thank you. Question for Babacar Fel. The 5 categories of object that can be interpreted as part of the culture of economic slavery. Porcelain can be found in another economic culture. What about objects used by the slave in daily life? Shoes, clothes, for example?
Yes, then some of these objects they exist. They are displayed in a number of these museums. Not true. I'm not saying the truth. In the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you find those that survived, and this is the problem that was already addressed in one of the previous questions. However, I would bring to light here one case. There are these excavations that we had, for example, in the in the African Burial Ground here in New York City. Also in the case of the Valongo Wharf in Rio de Janeiro, that these objects of daily use, not clothes, but especially then religious objects that or pipes or other objects that were even some of them enslaved people were buried with them, then these would be perhaps objects that survived because of the kind of material that would allow us to better understand this this history. And then these archaeologists who have been doing work in these different plantations, for example, I think here in the United States, in the area where I live, in Virginia, these presidential plantations, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, these are places where this kind of items have been found. Now, the porcelain, there were in some cases that these items could be found then in slave quarters as well. Then I think that we have to think in terms of the circulation of these objects. None of them were necessarily specific to a group, that they could circulate. And this can be problematic, but can help us also to identify this dynamic.
Thank you. I'm going to read the last question from Gibriru Doda. I hope I say correctly, sorry. You talked a lot about nature and culture. Beyond the ordinary uses of prestige for work of other purpose, have you noticed a real cultural resistance to slavery through objects? Were there objects specifically for education in order to perpetuate African culture of value, for example, to their children?
I would say that this, perhaps would be go too far, but I believe that I perceived in some cases the fact that in some of these objects we have formal elements that are in depth to African cultures, especially religious objects, in objects of prestige. Even those fabricated in Europe would follow these models. And through that, of course, there was a demand for these objects. Now, in terms of resistance, I would say that this would be then in the case of the Americas, and I think that we have many examples, especially through artists and artisans who produce these objects. But here I would also remember about different objects that are usually characterized as talismans, for example, or amulets. And this here I refer in particular to the works of Cécile Froment and also Matthew Harry. Both are doing interesting work about these objects, sometimes using documents as well, but using the objects themselves. I didn't work in particular on these objects. Sometimes I collect the images of them. And I think that these are the most powerful objects in terms of this cultural resistance, then through African religions that were, of course, passed down. And of course, later on, even today, I am taking it as an example, this current exhibition here at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Afro-Atlantic Histories. And there are a number of works presented that are works by Afro-Brazilian artists, and some of them are artists connected to Candomblé temples that are Candomblé being an Afro-Brazilian religion. And these individuals who were spiritual leaders, but also artists, they were resisting through the creation of these objects. Then, of course, these are not people who are enslaved. These are people who are doing this already in the 20th century, but it's part of this long tradition, I would say that way.
Thank you very much, everyone. Unfortunately, our time is ending. I would like, please join me in thanking Professor Araujo for this presentation. It was really interesting. I would like to announce that in 2 weeks, we are going to have our last workshop, and it's about the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, Potential and Limitation by Gregory O'Malley and Alex Borucki. Please, you're going to receive email from me. We hoping to see you there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.